Hi everyone, my name is Justin. I'm the creator of OSnap, an iOS application for making time-lapse and stop-motion photography projects on your iPhone or iPad. In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at landscape and portrait projects in OSnap, as well as the general concepts of landscape and portrait and how they apply to different parts of the app. The first thing I want to point out is that OSnap as an app is designed to work in both landscape and portrait. So assuming that my device system orientation lock is off, I can rotate my device and the app will transfer to landscape. So first, I'm just going to make sure that my device orientation lock is off. And then I can just rotate my device and you can see that the app converts to landscape. Now it may be obvious, but I want to make sure it's clear that whether you are using OSnap in landscape or portrait mode, it has nothing whatsoever to do with whether or not your OSnap projects are landscape or portrait or square. They are completely different concepts. The next thing I'd like to take a look at is the OSnap camera screen. Now, if you're holding your device in portrait, then the camera screen will be in portrait. However, if you rotate your device to landscape, you can see that the camera controls have rotated to landscape, and what that means is the camera screen is now in landscape and it will capture photos in landscape. And you can rotate it landscape left, or you can rotate it landscape right, and you'll see that the camera controls have adjusted. And it's important to point out that the camera screen will rotate regardless as to whether or not your device system orientation is locked. Now, sometimes it's better to unlock your device system orientation if you want to be shooting in landscape. It can make it a little more convenient because your dialog boxes will end up being sideways like this. You can see that the dialog box is sideways unless you unlock your device orientation, in which case all of your dialogues will be in the proper orientation. Now, because the OSnap camera screen will rotate regardless as to whether or not your device orientation lock is set, it's important to have a way to lock the camera orientation in those situations where you don't want the camera to rotate. I'm in OSnap Pro 2 right now, and the way that you lock camera orientation is by swiping down and then tapping the button in the upper left corner. So now you can see that when I rotate the device, the camera stays in portrait. If I unlock the orientation, you can see that the device switches to landscape. I can then lock the orientation again and rotate it to portrait, and it will stay in landscape. I'm just going to unlock it. Again, I'm working in OSnap Pro 2 right now. If you are in OSnap or OSnap Pro, you can lock the orientation by tapping the orientation lock button in the lower left of the camera screen. So I'm just going to move back to the home screen. And the last thing I'd like to explore is the concept of landscape and portrait and square projects, which again is a concept that is completely distinct from if you're using OSnap in portrait or landscape, and if you're capturing photos in portrait or landscape. I'm just going to turn my device landscape for fun since we're exploring the concepts of portrait and landscape. So I'm just going to create a new project. Now you can see that when I create a new project, I'm given the option of choosing the project orientation, which is either auto, landscape, portrait, or square. Most of the time, your best bet is to simply leave this on auto, which tells OSnap to look at the first photo in the sequence and use that photo to determine if the project is landscape, portrait, or square. So if the photo is a landscape photo, it will make the project landscape. If it is a portrait photo, it will make it portrait. If it is square, it will make the project square. It's worth mentioning that you can later change the orientation setting of a project at any time in your project settings. And so if you have your project set to auto, with the exception of the first image, you can have a mixture of images of any orientation within the project, meaning your project could contain landscape images, portrait images, and square images. But when it's set to auto, it will simply look at that very first image. And obviously, if you have the orientation set to landscape or portrait or square, it will force that orientation for the project, regardless of what the first image is. So you could technically have a project composed entirely of portrait images, but have the orientation of the project set to landscape, which would force it to be landscape. So now I'm going to import some images of different orientations in order to demonstrate what I'm describing. So with this new project, I'm just going to tap Create, and then I'm going to tap Import Photos. I'm just going to tap Select All. and the photos are imported. Now I'm going to go to the playback screen. And the project begins to play. So you can see that this project is a mixture of landscape and portrait images. And because the very first image in the sequence is a landscape image, OSnap determines that this project is supposed to be a landscape project. And you can see that when we get to the portrait images, there is a slight gray border that you can see that tells you exactly the size of the project and how the video will render. I'm just going to press pause. And now what I'm going to do is change this project to portrait. So under general orientation, I'm going to tap until it is changed to portrait, and then I'm going to return to the playback screen. So now you can see that the project has been forced into a portrait orientation, even though the first images are landscape. And you can see that those images, those landscape images, have been shrunken down so that they can fit into a portrait viewport. I'm just going to press pause and return back to the project home screen. And now I'm going to change the project to square. Again, I'm just going to tap where it says orientation, and now it says square, and I'm going to return to the playback screen. Now you can see that what we have is a square project, and all of the images have been forced into that square orientation. So the landscape images have been shrunken down with blank space on the top and the bottom, and the portrait images have blank space on the left and the right. I'm just going to rotate my device into portrait now. And the one last thing I'd like to show you is that I'm just going to change this project back to portrait, and then I'm going to go to the playback screen. And you can see I'm going to pause here for a moment, and you can see that the landscape images, again, they've been shrunken down to fit into a portrait orientation. And I'm just going to tap forward until I get to portrait. Now, what I'd like you to notice is that this portrait image, you can see that there is a little bit of empty space on the left and a little bit of empty space on the right. This portrait image is not fully filling up the entire viewport. And the reason for that is because I designated that this particular project is supposed to be portrait. The first image in the sequence is landscape. So when OSnap looks at the first image in the sequence and says, okay, this image is landscape, it doesn't actually know what the aspect ratio is supposed to be. It only knows it's supposed to be portrait, so it chooses a standard 4:3 portrait ratio. However, now I'm going to go to the frames screen, and I'm going to select the last portrait image, and I'm going to move that portrait image to the very first frame of the sequence. And now I'm going to go back to the playback screen, and I'm going to pause on this portrait image. Now what I'd like you to notice is that this portrait image fills the entire viewport, and here's why. The project is set to portrait, and if the first image is portrait, then OSnap knows exactly what dimensions and aspect ratio that it wants to set the project orientation to. So it's not going to choose a standard 4:3. It's going to look at that first image, and it's going to say, I'm going to make this project orientation exactly that aspect ratio and exactly those pixel dimensions. So that's one important nuance to consider when you're choosing a landscape or portrait orientation for your project. If the first image in the project does not match the orientation of the project, then OSnap is simply going to choose either portrait 4:3, landscape 4:3, or square, which is 1:1, depending on what you've specified. So again, in conclusion, it's generally speaking best just to leave your project orientation on auto unless you're doing something very specific and intentional. And hopefully this tutorial has covered some of the nuances of the different ways that you can apply landscape and portrait concepts to your project. So that concludes this tutorial on landscape and portrait. Thank you everybody so much for watching. Thanks everyone for watching. If you'd like to see more tutorials, leave us your thoughts in the comments, or you can email us at osnap@osnapphotoapp.com.